Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm the host, Brandon Vaught. I'm the content director at Word on Fire. Joining us is the magnanimous Bishop of Los Angeles, Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, welcome.
Brandon, good morning. Always great to be with you.
Now, you get to see a lot of movies. You've commented on tons of them over the years, but you recently saw one that you've been very, very high on. You've been very positive about it. Tell us about that.
Oh, yeah. Ingrid Goes West. I think I saw a coming attraction for it, several weeks ago. And I knew nothing about it. It looked kind of quirky and funny. So I went to see it. And it's actually a very searching movie, I think, about our contemporary culture and the obsession with the iPhone and how that's distorted a lot of our lifestyles, our relationships. It's a funny movie. It's a kind of a dark comedy, but it's a very incisive commentary, I think, on the way we've created false selves really around the iPhone and how it precludes the possibility often of a real encounter of the person right in front of you, the living, breathing person in front of you. And so I thought it was helpful for especially a lot of people in this so-called iGen, people who have come of age in the last, 15 years or so, who've never known a world without the smartphone. People that in many cases are literally sleeping with their iPhones. You know what I mean? The kids and young people that they'll fall asleep with the iPhone next to them, that the last thing they do before they go to sleep is look at the first thing in the morning and they look at the smartphone. That's doing something to us, which is not altogether good. And Ingrid Goes West is about that.
Well, just to affirm that we're not totally anti-technology, we got some exciting news. We got some a big news, actually. In 1 week, so by the time this episode airs, exactly 1 week from this day, we will be going to Facebook. And we don't mean Facebook.com. We mean that Bishop Barron will be going to Facebook's headquarters out in Menlo Park, California. They've invited Bishop Barron there to come and give a talk to several of the employees there. Bishop, tell us what you've chosen for your subject.
Yeah, originally I thought I'd do something in, more standard apologetics, talk about God, about why it makes sense to believe and that sort of thing. But I think, Brandon, you and I knocked around a little bit and decided it might be good to talk about how to have a religious argument. Because a lot of Facebook and social media, you'll find people that are shouting about religion. They're bad-mouthing it and then shouting back in its favor. That we've forgotten, I think, how to have a real intelligent engagement around religion. So I'm going to lay out some kind of rules and principles that ought to govern the way we argue. Because I'm going to say there's a middle ground between a bland toleration and violence. I think people think those are the only two options when it comes to religion. Either, oh my God, I just tolerate everybody, don't bring it up, or it's going to devolve into violence. And I think, come on, man, there's a very wide space. I'd call it religious argument, where we really can engage these questions intelligently and respectfully. So I'll be talking about that at Facebook.
So really excited about that. I have some details here at the end of the episode about ways that you can watch this talk, because we've been working with Facebook and Facebook has agreed to live stream the talk through Bishop Barron's page. So stay tuned to the end of the episode. I'll give you all the details on that. Okay, Bishop, today we want to talk about something that's become sort of a hot button issue in the church, and it's this apparent divide between two groups, the so-called pro-life Catholics and the so-called social justice Catholics. This divide is at the heart of a conference coming up called the Cornerstone Catholic Conference. That conference is seeking to sort of heal this divide, and you're going to be giving the keynote at this conference. The conference is in Tahoma, Washington from October 20th to the 21st. First, maybe give us a little background on this apparent divide. How did this come about?
Well, that's a good question, actually, and I don't know if there's a really clear answer. I think we can identify when it came about. It came about in the years following the council, and I have always been very careful to say not because of the council. Vatican II is wonderful along these lines, but somehow after the council, we tended to fall in this divide. One way to do it too is people that are into the liturgy and into vestments and sacristies and candles and all that, and then people that are out in the street taking care of the poor. And I've always regretted that distinction, or as you've been putting it here, between the more gospel of life people and the social justice people. Look at John Paul II. I mean, I don't know anybody in the last 50 years who better embodied a massive commitment to both. And they're both under the aegis of love, which is what the church is about, willing the good of the other. One set of issues cluster around these life issues of euthanasia and abortion and so on, sexuality. Others cluster around the more economic and political issues. Okay, they're both demands of love. You can trace it all the way back through the church's great tradition, to the church fathers, deeply into the Bible itself, So the division is a really regrettable thing in my judgment. And one of the bitter fruits of that post-conciliar period, again, not because of the council. It's not Vatican II, but there was something, and there's a lot of cultural reasons for that too that we could explore, of why this divide happened. But we need to get over it.
Now, we're going to get into some of the particularities here and perhaps chart a way forward. But before we do that, I want to get your thoughts on this, that it strikes me as a convert to the church especially, that whenever we see these divides, it always seems to be this strong emphasis on either or. But as you have said, Catholicism is almost in every case a both and religion. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think it's one of the ways you can characterize it, and it's our genius. It's the glory. It's the attractive quality of Catholicism. Chesterton saw that very clearly, didn't he? Another famous convert to the faith. And I think this is a good example. We're for both these things all the way. Or do Chesterton? We want the white flag waving and the red flag waving, and we don't want the pink flag. We don't want to compromise. We don't want one or the other. We want both all the way, And I think the great figures up to and including John Paul II exemplified this.
Okay, let's dig a little deeper into each of these phrases. Let's look at social justice first. I know for many Catholics that's become somewhat of a dirty phrase, but in the church's social teaching, is it? What does it mean? Should we avoid it? Should we use it? What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, trace that all the way back again to the great Israelite prophets. You can't read someone like Amos or someone like Hosea or Isaiah or Ezekiel or Jeremiah and not be struck by this profound concern for, want of a better phrase, social justice. In other words, not just moral rectitude at the individual level, but moral rectitude at the collective and political and social and economic level. The Bible recognizes individual sin very clearly, no question about that. The Bible also recognizes what we call today institutional or systemic sin. So this is nothing new. This is not like something from the 1960s. This is from Jeremiah. And it comes right up, of course, to Jesus himself, who speaks certainly a lot about personal sin, but knew very well the existence of systemic evil. Now, trace it all the way through the church fathers. I've often quoted John Chrysostom, who famously said, if you've got two shirts in your closet, one belongs to you, the other belongs to the man who has no shirt. Railing against the political leadership of the time. Trace it all the way now up through the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, and the deep concern for the common good. So Thomas knew all about individual sin, certainly called people to individual repentance, but he knew all about the demand to cultivate the common good. Now, bring it all the way up to the church's social teaching, commencing with Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum, and then bring it right up to Pope Francis. And you've got a steady commitment to this idea. So to see social justice as something, dirty or something the church shouldn't be about, that's just crazy.
It's typical in Catholic circles that a lot of the moral and political and social issues will be sort of lined up on either side of this divide. So on the pro-life side, you have opposition to abortion or euthanasia. On the social justice side, you have issues dealing with war and poverty, etc. I've found that most Catholics I know don't necessarily think that only one or two of those groups of issues are right. It's just a question of emphasis. What's your take on whether these pro-life issues or these social justice issues should require equal attention or emphasis, or does that emphasis oscillate over time?
Yeah, and I think, Brandon, with that question, we kind of come to the heart of the matter. So what we've been saying so far, it's all right and true, but it's at a more general level. I mean, first of all, I would just stress again the particular genius of Catholicism, that it transcends our political divide in this country, certainly. So is Catholic social teaching, now broadly construed, I mean moral and social teaching, is it Democrat or Republican? Well, it's impossible to say. Because as you suggest, some issues align more with the Republican emphasis, others align more with the Democratic emphasis. And so that's part of our genius, I think, is that we transcend those splits. That's why the church is always in a somewhat awkward position vis-a-vis the great political parties in our country. We don't simply identify with one or the other. That's why the church is careful not to endorse a particular political party or platform or candidate. Okay, so having said that, that's part of the genius of it. I think there is discrimination to be made at the level of intrinsic evil versus prudential judgment. So, for example, some acts are sufficiently defined so that we can say, yes, that act in itself is intrinsically evil. Abortion being a good example. So the direct killing of the innocent. We would say in our social teaching, in our moral teaching, that there's no circumstance or motivation that would ever justify an abortion. It's by its very nature morally objectionable. Same is true of euthanasia, right? I mean, so taking the life of an elderly person because he or she is sick or they're tired of living or whatever it is, we'd recognize that as intrinsically evil. Those have a political priority in the mind of the church, that we should oppose those first, if you want. Now, other issues we might identify as involving an intrinsically immoral attitude. Let's say, for example, there were a person that said, I just don't care at all about the environment. I think that's a waste of time. I think that's old, tree-hugging liberalism. I don't care about the environment. Well, yeah, I'd say that's an intrinsically evil attitude. I think that's an attitude that ought to be opposed. But see, where it gets more pointed is if you were to say, therefore, I am against the political party that is favoring offshore drilling. Well, see, now we're getting down into a particular case where we can't make that clear a moral judgment because offshore drilling is not intrinsically evil, right? Now, it might be evil, and that's a prudential judgment in a particular circumstance in this place and time and so on. I might make the prudential judgment that, yeah, we shouldn't be doing that. But that's a matter where people of goodwill can disagree. The church oughtn't to be intervening to say, oh, yeah, offshore drilling should never happen. So I'm just giving one example there to distinguish between what is clearly intrinsically evil and what is a matter of prudential judgment. There, the church does come in and make a discrimination. That's a quick answer to a very complex, really set of questions.
Okay, so we've at least gone over a little bit of the basis for this lamentable divide. Let's talk about how we can begin to heal it. You recently did an interview in anticipation of this Cornerstone Catholic conference you're speaking at, where you suggested that the liturgy might be a source of healing. Talk about that.
Well, one of my great heroes, in fact, as I'm recording these words, I'm looking at his photograph right now on my office wall, is Reinhold Hillenbrand, who was my illustrious predecessor as rector of Mundelein Seminary back in the 30s and 40s. And Hillenbrand was one of the leaders in the liturgical movement in our country. But his central point was, and see, I think it got obscured after the council, sadly. His central point was the liturgy is in some ways the great engine for social justice. That we take what has happened at the liturgy and we then move it out into the world. The liturgy becomes is the graced moment that then gives rise to the transfiguration of the world. So Hillenbrand would say, if you're interested in social justice, the very best thing you could do is go to Mass. Now, if I want to press this thing a little bit, one reason this thing's become problematic is so many Catholics have stopped going to Mass, right? We got 75% of Catholics don't go to Mass. That sets up a tension and a divide that Hillenbrand would have bemoaned.
What do you think the saints can offer when it comes to healing this divide? I know when I first came into the church, I was surprised by this divide. I didn't see it coming. And it was especially surprising because during my conversion, I was reading the memoirs of Dorothy Day, of the biographies of John Paul II, all these figures for whom there didn't really seem to be a problem. So how do you think the saints can help us move forward?
She's a great example, Dorothy Day, who's been a hero of mine for a long time. And I often say to audiences, was there anyone in the 20th century who was more committed to this church's social program than Dorothy Day? I mean, the care for the poor, an anti-war emphasis, all of it, right? At the same time, Dorothy Day spent a lot of the day on her knees in prayer. At Mass, at benediction, in confession, on retreat. Was she a lady of the sacristy and the sanctuary? You bet she was. Was she a lady of the streets, of the poor and so on? Absolutely. And was there a divide in her mind? Absolutely not. See, I think she was very close to the attitude of Hillenbrand. It's the Mass, it's prayer, it's the retreat, it's liturgy that leads you out to social justice. The other great example, in my mind, is Mother Teresa. Was anyone, with the possible exception of Dorothy Day, more committed to care for the poor and then being on the streets with those who are in need than Mother Teresa? And she spent much of her day on her knees in prayer, at Mass, at benediction, on retreat. And so, in their minds, this divide is just silly, And I think you look at them and you see, oh yeah, that's how you heal it. You live life the way those two women live their lives.
In this interview that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, you were also asked which Catholics today, so not necessarily saints of the 20th century, which Catholics today do you really think exemplify this unity of the Church's pro-life and social justice concerns? What would you say to that?
Yeah, and my answer was Pope Francis. Everyone now readily recognizes, Pope Francis is the Pope of the poor and go to the peripheries and on the streets and smell like the sheep. And yes, I'd say to all of that. But listen to him more thoroughly. What will you hear? You'll hear a very powerful commitment to what I call the Evangelium Vitae issues, right? The gospel of life issues. Is he against abortion? Passionately so. Is he against euthanasia? Yeah, listen to him on the throwaway culture sometime. Is he against ideological colonization? You bet. He said it many times. The way we're exporting to much of the world what in his mind is a poisonous ideology of self-invention. Is he against transgenderism? Yeah, listen to him over and over again. So I think there it is. You want to see the gospel of life issues and the social justice issues? Look no further than the current Holy Father.
All right, let's wrap up here with a final question. Suppose you were speaking to a large room, and I guess this is probably going to be the case at the Quarterstone Catholic Conference, where you have a large group of Catholics who self-identify as social justice-minded Catholics and a large group who predominantly identify as pro-life Catholics. What would you say to this large group of people?
I'd say both of you go to Mass, and at the Mass, you're going to find the point of contact. That if there is a divide, it's because the liturgy has not been completely internalized. So I would say let that be our point of beginning and end. It's the source and summit of the Christian life. I think it's a staying away from the Mass that's led to some of these unhappy divides. Then I'd also say talk to each other, and you're going to find so much common ground, I think. Don't allow the political framework of Western society to set the agenda, but rather let it come up from the Bible and from the fathers and from the Church's teaching. And then I think we'll see this clearer commonality.
Well, it's time now for one of our questions from our listeners. We love hearing from you guys. So if you have a question, please visit askbishopbarron.com and record your question. We listen to all of them. And every single episode, we pick out one to air here and share it with Bishop Barron. Today we have a question from Phil from Washington, who asked something that's a perennial question for Christians, and it's right in line with the topic of this episode. So here's Phil's question.
Hello, Bishop Barron. My name is Phil, and I live in Bothell, Washington. Thank you for taking my question. What are our obligations to people begging outside a grocery store or on the street? Do I do them more harm than good by perpetuating their lifestyle? And is it enough to financially support organizations which can better deliver necessities? My wife always asks me, what if that person is Jesus? And I have no answer to that. What are we asked to do as Catholics and Christians?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'll tell you a story. I was newly ordained, and we had people in the neighborhood who would come to rectories, and they would ask for money. And of course, I'm 26 years old. I'm a newly ordained priest, and I'd see these people, and I would say, oh my gosh, it's terrible. And you need to get a bus to get to Atlanta. And they had these elaborate stories, And so I was giving away huge amounts of money to these folks. And then I remember the pastor, who was a dear man, Joe Canane, lovely man, sat me down, and he explained to me how a lot of the folks that come to the rectory are kind of well-known charlatans, and that they would especially target the newly ordained. They'd find out where they were assigned, and they'd go there. And so, I mean, it was for me a kind of eye-opener that, well, maybe not everybody begging for money is really in need. That's the first thing. I remember another great mentor of mine, Monsignor Bill Quinn. I asked him the very question you're asking me. He said, I've been a priest for 52 years, and I still don't have a really good answer to that question. And I think that's true, because what you're saying is right. There's something very deep in our tradition that says, no, give to the person asking from you. And yes, it could be Christ in a distressing disguise, absolutely. But then the other side, as you suggest correctly, I think, is it the best way to be helping people by giving them money which might go to something which is not so good for them? Is it best perhaps to be very faithful in contributing to charities and so on that take care of people in a more constructive way? And I guess my answer is yes to all of those. I'm saying is I don't know if there's a clear path that I can say that's what you should always do. To some degree, prudential judgment's involved. I think tithing, that you give every year 10% of your income away to the poor, and I mean that broadly, so however you want to decide, but that you have a strong commitment to caring for the poor. How you do it, that's one way, tithing, giving to institutions that support. Maybe it's a third story. When I was in Calcutta filming for the Mother Teresa episode, we were right outside the Mother House, and up to me came a young kid who was begging. Well, I went instinctually to get some money out of my pocket. One of the sisters, one of Mother Teresa's nuns, came flying at me, and she said, no. And she stopped me because she said, you'll be overwhelmed by an army of beggars. And she said to me, Father, don't worry, we take care of them. But her point was, but don't do it that way, see, in that time. What's my point? I think there's no clear right answer to this question. I think you've got to use prudential judgment. That we have to be committed to caring for the poor, no question about it. How? I think you can use your prudential judgment. Maybe in your situation, you see someone say, yeah, God, that guy really is in immediate need, and I'm going to do something directly for him. Good. I wouldn't judge that. But I don't think there's a clear answer. I don't know, Brandon, if you have a better answer to that.
Oh, not much more to add. I wish I did. Well, hey, Phil, thanks so much for that question. It was a great one. Listen, as we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, next Monday, which is September 18th, Bishop Barron will be at Facebook, not Facebook.com, but Facebook, their headquarters in Menlo Park. He'll be speaking there to a group of employees, and they're planning to live stream it. So if you'd like to see Bishop Barron's talk, here's what to do. Just visit his Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Bishop Robert Barron. And be ready for the live stream. It'll take place at 6 p.m. Eastern Time or 3 p.m. Pacific Time. on Bishop Barron's Facebook page. Again, it's Monday, September 18th. So follow us on Facebook. We're also going to be sharing some great pictures and behind-the-scenes videos from Facebook's headquarters and Instagram's headquarters. It's kind of all right there. So follow us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and be sure to stay on top of all that stuff. Well, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.